let's get started. We're going to talk about fentanyl tonight. And I am admittedly not an expert on fentanyl. I know a lot about it, and there may be someone in the room who knows more than me. And if that's the case, if you see any inaccuracies, please let me know. Or if you see anything that could be added, please also let me know. I also just want to touch really quickly that we're all here coming from a place to learn together in community. And this topic is really sensitive for a lot of people, for good reasons. And we're here tonight to learn from an objective standpoint with respect, sympathy, and support. There's people in this room I know who have used fentanyl recreationally. There's people probably in this room who have used fentanyl in a medicational capacity. And there's also people in this room who know others who have been hurt by fentanyl through adulteration, through dependency, or through being victims of the drug war and what it takes to get fentanyl to people. So please keep those things in mind. There's a lot of different opinions in the room, and all of those opinions are okay, and they all have a place here. All right, so just a quick rundown of what we'll be covering. We will start with psychedelic exceptionalism and stigmatization. Was anyone here for the introduction to psychedelics talk? A few? Okay, well, this will be a quick recap of that, but it'll go pretty quickly. Then we'll touch on what are opiates, how fentanyl works in the body, the different uses of fentanyl, the pressing data, where fentanyl comes from, scheduling and misinformation. The person who was going to do a personal account, their pipes froze today, so we're not going to do that one. And then substance checking, recognizing and responding to an overdose, and then finally, additional resources. So here we have the Alcohol and Drug Foundation wheel. I found this wheel to be really helpful for all sorts of different substances, figuring out what class these substances fall into, the effects of each substance. And a lot of times people will class these substances into some are better than others. And that is a term that we call exceptionalism. It's really common with psychedelic exceptionalism, which is an ideology that claims purportedly less harmful or less addictive drugs, such as cannabis, psilocybin mushrooms, or ayahuasca, are inherently better, safer, or more desirable for people to use than other drugs. So this happens for a lot of different reasons, and it can be bad because it puts people at risk. So some people who may be using the more harmful drugs could be put into deeper isolation. People don't want to talk with them, affiliate with them, associate with them. It marginalizes people. It stigmatizes a drug and the people who use it. It perpetuates the drug war, which is an entirely other conversation in itself. So one of the reasons this happens, it happens for 5 primary reasons that I've identified. One of those is the substance is relatively safe to use when compared to other substances. For example, alcohol is on this chart. It has a really harmful score of like over 70 as compared to mushrooms, which is less than 10. But the illusion that this is trying to portray is that psychedelics are safer to use than some of the other substances. Alcohol, heroin, crack, meth, opiates are often categorized into the top category here. But really, responsible and informed use can happen with all drugs. And there's risk with every substance on this entire chart. And it's really how you're using it, why you're using it, where. So for example, Carl Hart has a really good example that mushrooms are safer than heroin when it comes to higher doses and respiratory arrest, which is true. But heroin is safer than mushrooms when it comes to higher doses and paranoia, which is also true. The second reason we see exceptionalism is with the reasons for use. So some of the reasons people use psychedelics are social or recreational purposes, curiosity, stress management. They enable the user to get into what they perceive as a more enlightened sense of thinking or being. It can be therapeutic. You lean into emotions, explore new ways to feel about something, or avoid difficult emotions. There's exploration, and then there's medical treatment. And these are usually reasons that people can get behind. People are usually pretty supportive of these reasons. And really, these are the same reasons that people are using other substances too. People use other substances because they're curious, or because they're trying to cope with stress management, or is therapeutic, might have a medical capacity or potential. So people are using all sorts of substances for all types of reasons, and really a lot of the reasons are the same. A third reason exceptionalism happens is because there's instant addiction narratives. So a similar, billboard to this one was up in town in Leadville where I was growing up, which is a really small town, which has like literally one billboard and something like this was on it. And it shook the whole town. The picture was this woman who was like scratching her back, and it said meth not even once, and it was really scary. And the idea is that you're gonna have meth once and you're gonna be addicted to it forever. And your life is gonna go to shit, and it's just not good. So that's not true for any substance. You don't have any substance one time and become physically dependent on it. It just doesn't happen. Substance dependency can be a mental or physical dependency, and when you consider addiction, it's also important to consider how it happened. Think about the human who's behind the dependency, and what are they going through? What are they trying to get out of that substance use? Uh-oh. Okay. And then we have the fourth exceptionalism reason that I see pretty commonly is that psychedelics have proven medical benefits, which is true, they do. But so does every other substance on the planet. Every other substance has proven medical benefits. And then finally, another common reason for exceptionalism is that successful people use psychedelics. That's true. We've got Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Elon Musk. And yeah, all of those people do use psychedelics, and a lot of successful people use a lot of other substances too. A lot of successful people use stimulants, use opiates, use dissociatives, and even more unsuccessful people use all of these substances too. So yeah, it's just all across the board, successful to not successful. Everyone is using every kind of substance for every reason, and yeah, it's just across the board. The bottom line is that responsible and informed drug use can happen with all drugs, and the final user is the only one who can define what that looks like for themselves. So if you still have doubts, Carl Hart has a great quote, and he says, "I challenge you to broaden your scope of the people who use those drugs." So, all right, with that, we'll go back to the Alcohol and Drug Foundation wheel, and you'll see that fentanyl falls into the opiate category of that wheel, opioid rather. So some other opioids we have are buprenorphine, codeine, heroin, methadone, naltrexone, opium, and codone. Some of the effects people report are euphoria, relaxation and well-being, pain relief, impaired concentration, sleepy, reduced sex drive, sweating, constipation, and sometimes heart and lung problems. So yep, pros and cons, just as with every other substance. So let's touch on what are opioids. So first, we can't talk about opioids without talking about opiates first. Opiates are chemical compounds that are extracted or refined from natural plant matter, so from poppy sap and fibers. Opium itself is from like directly from the poppy plant. It's this sap. So you have the pod, the poppy pod, and then you'll get a little razor and it's called scoring it. And this sap comes out, it's the brown stuff here. And scraping that right off from the poppy pod, that will give you opium. And that's illegal, don't do that. There's pretty serious consequences. But that's opium, and that's like the most staple opiate that you can get straight from the poppy. So opiates, other opiates are sourced primarily from that sap. And some of those include opium itself and just the straight sap, or there's morphine or codeine, and heroin is also an opiate. And then we have opioids, which are chemical compounds that are partially derived from natural plant matter or fully synthetic. Most opioids are made in a lab. So a few opioid molecules we have are hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxycodone, which are partially synthesized from chemical components of opium. Or we have fully synthesized from, like in a lab, that didn't have anything to do with the poppy aside from the molecular structure, which was made synthetically. And that's where fentanyl comes from. The pharmaceutical industry has created over 500 different opioid molecules. Over 500, that's a lot. And so yeah, fentanyl is an opioid because it's made synthetically in a lab. So opioids work, what happens is when you ingest the opioid, or it's put into the body in some other manner through a patch, through an injection, or whatever route people are ingesting opioids nowadays, we get, there's also lozenges, that's a fun one. So you'll get the opioid into the body, and the opioid goes through the bloodstream up into the brain, comes to an opioid receptor, which is this little green thing in this image. Mind you, this is all theoretical. Humans don't really know much about brain chemistry or anything about their brain really, so theoretically, the opioid comes into the brain and binds to an opioid receptor, which is the green thing here. And then that's when the high comes on. So following that, most opioids pass through the liver. The drug goes to the liver to filter out other unnecessary chemicals before entering in the bloodstream. And then when the opioids are taken intravenously, that step is skipped and the drug goes directly into the circulatory system. The bloodstream then carries the opioid chemicals to the brain. Opioid binds to the receptor. And depending on which opioid you have, the effects can last for minutes to hours, and it really just depends on which type you have and like the route of administration for that. And then finally, the remnants of the opiates are processed through the excretory system. The effects will wear out, and the remnants of the drug will be passed through the bloodstream again, where the kidneys clean the blood of the opioid, and it's eventually excreted through urine, sweat, saliva, or other bodily fluids. Feels like it got darker in here. Does the lights go out? Maybe. Okay. So 3 common places that fentanyl is sometimes present: as a medication, a recreational substance, or as an adulterant. So, as a medication, fentanyl is really just one of the best on the market. Opioids in general are some of the best pain management medications in Western medicine that is on the market, and fentanyl itself is 50 to 100 times more powerful than morphine. It's used every day in every emergency room in every hospital. And the chances are, if you break a bone or rupture a vessel in your brain or suffer a bad burn, there's a good chances that you're going to be given fentanyl in the emergency department. It's really fast acting, it's really effective. And it's also used as a pain management method for people who are discharged from the hospital as well. So the analgesic effects, which is like pain management effects, last for 30 to 60 minutes for an IV injection, which is pretty common as the route of administration in medical settings. And the onset is within 5 minutes. 5 minutes is a pretty long estimate. Like really, it's almost instantly. It's just straight into the bloodstream. So I have some stats here from the Center for Policy and Research in Emergency Medicine in Oregon. And so they did a comparison for fentanyl with morphine. And prior to fentanyl being used as a staple for pain management, morphine was the staple. And so morphine is like another opiate. So in this study, they had initial pain scores on a scale of 1 to 10, how much pain are people feeling? And the scores started with 8.1 and 8.3. So pretty similar pain scores for the people who got the two different medications. Someone came into the ER, said they had a pain score between 8.1 and 8.3, and they were given one of those two medications, morphine and fentanyl. The mean decreases in pain were pretty similar. The people who received morphine had a decrease in pain of 2.9, and people who had a mean decrease, or people who received fentanyl had a mean decrease of 3.1 in pain. Not enough to really gauge one medication better than the other yet. After that, we can see the adverse events. That could be a lot of different things. Morphine had 9.9%, fentanyl had 6.6%. The majority of those adverse events came to nausea, which is what it really comes down to in the medical system of the difference between fentanyl and morphine. Morphine, it's really common for people to get nausea, and fentanyl, 3.8% compared to 7% for morphine, which is where morphine really drives home as a pain management medication. It doesn't make people nauseous as much. It can for some. All right, and now we have fentanyl as a recreational substance. All of those things that people talked about, or not people talked about, all those things listed in the prior slides on exceptionalism. Why are people using fentanyl as a recreational substance? There's a lot of really good reasons. Social or recreational purposes, building like community around substance use is really common, and if you're making friends who are using fentanyl, some people it might not be a big hurdle to use that substance with them. It would build community. Curiosity, stress management. It enables the user to enter into what they perceive as a more enlightened sense of thinking or being. So people who use fentanyl talk a lot about feeling warm and comfortable and safe, and that might be perceived as a more enlightened sense of being for a lot of people. It's therapeutic, for sure. And then there's also exploration for spiritual exploration, personal exploration, or whatever reason anyone could be using any substance for exploration-wise. It applies to fentanyl as well. Fentanyl is also used as an alternative for other opioids pretty regularly due to its potency. So it's relatively accessible compared to other substances that are illicitly sourced, and its use has been on the rise. Similar to other opiates, it has warm, calming, comforting effects, and it's pretty short-lasting. So that's the one thing about fentanyl as a recreational substance, is that it's compared to other recreational substances, it's pretty short-lasting. 30 minutes to an hour, and that can necessitate constant compulsive redosing for a lot of people. And that's where the issue comes in, where dependency might be an issue. And yeah, if you're feeling really warm and comfortable and you weren't feeling that prior, a lot of people might play with that happy medium. All right, and then finally, we have fentanyl as an adulterant. So fentanyl is really common. An adulterant is a substance that is included in a different, so say you're buying cocaine or MDMA or oxy. If you buy that and it has anything else in it than what you bought, then anything else is the adulterant. So, yeah, that's a good example. So, it's really common for opiates. It's really common for people who are buying heroin or oxy or really any other opiates because the effect is very similar, and fentanyl is so cheap that it's easy to put it into an oxy pill and save that money as the dealer than buying the oxy pill itself and reselling it. And aside from opiates, the adulteration in other substances really isn't always intentional. And it happens very regularly by mistake. So what's very common is, say you go to a dealer and they're weighing out fentanyl for someone else, may or may not be you, and then they put it in the scale like this. They dump out the scale, don't wash it, don't wipe it down, and then they weigh whatever you're buying. Cocaine, MDMA, whatever you're buying from that same person. That substance that you're buying likely has residue from the scale. And if the person who's buying it has zero opiate tolerance, that residue could be enough to really hurt them. Also on that note, say this is your substance in here, or anyone's substance. Say this is MDMA in the scale, and the residue on the side is fentanyl. So he's going to put all that in the bag. You're going to take it home. Your friend might have an experience that doesn't have fentanyl in it, but you might, because the residue is not evenly distributed within the whole substance. And that's called the chocolate chip cookie effect. So, or it's been coined as the chocolate chip cookie effect, I could say. Fentanyl can be like chocolate chips in a cookie. So it could be in some parts of it, but not all of it. So that's why sometimes some people who have, maybe like five people who have cocaine from a bag, maybe one or two of them has a fentanyl problem, an issue with fentanyl in that bag, and the other three may not. All right. So the bottom line with that really is know who you're sourcing your substance from. If you are picking up substances from someone and you don't feel safe with that person to ask them, do you also sell fentanyl? Can I trust you to wash the scale in between you selling fentanyl and selling me this substance? If you can't talk about that with the person you're buying substances from, you shouldn't be buying substances from them. And also, typically, online sales are usually pretty safe. So if you can't talk with your dealer about that, maybe consider purchasing substances online. It's not always the safe, it's not safe in other ways, but it's usually pretty safe in that. And you should always test your substances for fentanyl regardless of where you get it, no matter what. Yes?
Why do you think that is, like speculation on that? Is it, if anything, if you don't have face-to-face contact with someone, wouldn't they be less incentivized to take it with you?
Yeah, so totally. If you don't have face-to-face contact with someone, they may be more incentivized to be dismissive of being careful of fentanyl. But I think that online sales of illicit substances are generally safer just because of the free market element of it. They're really competitive. There's pretty extensive reviews on most of them. And if something were to happen, the likelihood of them being getting a bad review on the site, I think, is pretty high, and that's going to look really bad for them, and they're going to lose a lot of business. So I think it's just benefits of free market and anti-drug war environments that you don't get adulteration as regularly. But that's not to say it doesn't happen. It still happens, and you still need to be careful. All right, so up next we'll go through some of the pressing data on why so many people are scared, not unjustly, but really what's going on. What are people talking about? Why are people afraid? So first and foremost, I think one of the reasons that many people are afraid is the parameters for overdose. If you don't have an opiate tolerance whatsoever, for some people, it can take 2 milligrams to induce an overdose. And the increase in overdoses has been increasing on a nationwide scale. So if you'll see this penny, that corner is 2 milligrams. And if you're a smaller person and you don't have any opiate tolerance whatsoever, that can be enough to really hurt you or kill you in some instances. And the increase in overdose fatalities and related to synthetic opiates, in 2011, that number was 2,666. In 2018, that number was 31,335. I hate to be the person up here to quote the DEA, but according to the DEA, between January 2021 and January 2022, it was 69,700 people who died related to synthetic opiate overdoses, largely fentanyl. So 2011, 2,600, 2018, 31,000, 2022, 69,000. Those aren't numbers to joke around with. It can get pretty serious. It is pretty serious. And of that 69,000, about 69% of that was attributed to fentanyl, specifically. So fentanyl has been the leading cause of death for young Americans since 2019, more than car accidents or any other way that young people die. In Colorado here, you can see the, I don't want to say accountability, but how much fentanyl has really increased relating to opioid overdose deaths. In 2000, there was maybe less than 5. 2010, it was in the 30s to 50s. And then in 2020, we're at over 400, specifically for fentanyl. And you can also see that the volume of fentanyl accountable for these deaths has also significantly increased. Up until 2018, it wasn't even half of the responsibility. And now at 2020, where this was taken, it was over half of the deaths were related to fentanyl. And I'm not sharing these numbers to scare people. That's not what we're trying to do up here. These numbers are up here to try to inform people so that you know that it's present and that you can take appropriate measures to protect yourself if you're using substances or you have friends or family who are. Do we have a question?
Yeah. Do you have a feel for how many of these deaths are due to accidental overdose versus fentanyl was in some other drug that they weren't aware of?
Yeah, that's a good question. If I have an idea on if it was intentional fentanyl ingestion or if it was fentanyl adulteration, I am not sure. Does anyone else in the room know?
Well, there have been some high-profile cases of, the 5 people who died in Commerce City last year. So there have been, it's been in the news, but...
Or that was an adulterated case?
That was, they think it was, they saying they thought it was cocaine, but 5 people died.
Yeah, I think with that one, in Commerce City, it was 5 friends getting together for a night at their home or their apartment, night for cocaine, hanging out, and all of them were found dead in their apartment, which is terrible. That one was definitely adulteration.
It's probably complicated too because in autopsy reports, they just see what's in the system, and often you're using multiple substances anyways, which is a problem for like assigning causes of death in drug abuse cases anyway. So I don't know if we can even use it upon if we have all the data, but good
Yeah.
cases on both sides.
Mm-hmm. You're right. All right. So another good point I wanted to bring up is there's a person in town named Mitchell Gomez. He owns and runs Stand Safe. Actually, Jacob showed me this quote the first time I saw it, but Mitchell Gomez had this quote that was saying where an overdose whereby the person was unaware of the substance they were ingesting is actually a prohibition-created drug adulteration death. So it's redirecting that accountability towards the larger powers that play for having intercepted in the free market in this way, and as such, substances are being adulterated with fentanyl. An overdose is an appropriate term for someone who had too much of a substance that they knew they were intentionally ingesting. If you know you're ingesting fentanyl and you have an overdose, you have too much and something bad happens, that's a classic overdose. If you buy MDMA and it has fentanyl in it, and you had too much fentanyl in the MDMA that you thought you were buying, that's not, an overdose shouldn't be the term allocated to that experience. That's a prohibition-created drug adulteration death. Because that happened because of prohibition, because people can't get the substances that they're intentionally buying legally. I'll die on that soapbox. All right. So, where does fentanyl come from? As we said earlier, it is a fully synthetic opioid, and it's really been increasing in presence within the last 10 years. So here, there's some back and forth on these arrows. I'm going to explain it a little bit. But initially, fentanyl was being shipped from China. There were legal limitations put in place once fentanyl started becoming an issue. And China started forwarding the... Chinese doesn't really have cartels. I don't want to say Chinese cartels started forwarding it to Mexico. But a lot of the precursors and substances for fentanyl is made by like very small operations in China, like a few labs, and they're sending it to Mexico. The full process is then finished and synthesized in Mexico, and then it's pushed up to the States through the cartels, I guess. So for one here, we have fentanyl in powdered form. Fentanyl in powdered form goes back and forth between India and China, and then also between India and Mexico, and for a while, China to the States. China to the States isn't really as common anymore. And then the powdered fentanyl, or precursors to that, are processed in, some of it is happening in Canada, a lot of it is also happening in Mexico. And it's in those places that it's also mixed with heroin and other opiates. It's probably also happening in the States, to be realistic. And then, most of the precursors are sent from China to the US and Mexico, and then, between Mexico and Canada, pushed into the States. So, that's how that's working right now. And then we also have the scheduling of fentanyl. Fentanyl has really gone through the ringer with scheduling. So substances are scheduled into 5 different categories based on what they can offer to society. The first schedule is absolutely no medical use. It has a high potential for abuse and a high potential for addiction. Schedule 2 does have a medical use, but also still has high potential for abuse and addiction. Schedules 3 and 4 are pretty similar. Known medical use, moderate potential for abuse and addiction, and then Schedule 4 is, or Schedule 5 rather, is it does have medical use and no potential for abuse or addiction. Those are things like Robitussin. Robitussin is abused. Robitussin is not scheduled correctly in Schedule 5. Or like acetaminophen or other things are Schedule 5. The differences between Schedule 4 and Schedule 3 are the penalties for illegal possession. So how much you have, how is it like look like it's going to be distributed, or circumstantial. And all of these were made as part of the Controlled Substances Act, which was a statute that established federal U.S. drug policy under which the manufacture, importation, possession, use, and distribution were all regulated. Nixon signed that act in 1970, and it became law in 1971. So over 50 years, our substances have been scheduled into these 5 categories. And so fentanyl, as we discussed earlier, it does have a medical use. It does have a potential for abuse, and it has a pretty high potential for addiction. So it was originally scheduled as Schedule 2 because it does have known medical use. However, in February 2018, there was a class-wide scheduling for fentanyl and all of the fentanyl analogs to be put into Schedule 1, despite it having medical use. And this was because the consequences that it had for people on the street did not outweigh the medical benefits for it. So put into Schedule 1, very limited research, not being used in medical settings. And then that was supposed to be lifted in February 2020. It was just an emergency scheduling. They were going to figure it out, and then hopefully by 2020 it was going to be lifted. But Congress passed legislation extending that order to May 6th, 2021. So between February 2018 and May 6th, 2021, it was pushed into Schedule 1. And then it was extended further to September 6th, 2021. And now it's back in Schedule 2. Alrighty. The person who was going to do a personal account on their experience with fentanyl tonight had his pipes freeze at his house, so he couldn't make it. But from what he had told me about it was this person was in very significant, substantial pain, and they were using what they thought was Percocet to manage that pain. And the pills were pressed as if they were Percocet. They were the Percocet that he had remembered. He was getting them from the street. He was not getting them through a medical route. And he started picking up an issue with it, which isn't uncommon for people using Percocet. Sometimes that can happen. And from what I remember, he went to a doctor, and the doctor tried to wean him off of Percocet. And it wasn't working because he wasn't having Percocet for 2 or 3 years. That whole time, he was having fentanyl that was pressed into pills that looked exactly like Percocet. And it was from someone he knew, that he thought he knew well. And it was a whole process of having to wean off of fentanyl. And I believe he found his relief through Ibogaine, which she was also going to talk a little bit about Ibogaine as a treatment for opioid dependency. So yeah, I'm sorry he couldn't be here tonight. I hope that his pipes are fine. I hope it's still pretty cold out there. So, all right, how to test for fentanyl adulteration. How to test if it's in your substances. I left those little baggies in the car, Michael. Damn it. But, yeah, so the first thing to do when testing for fentanyl adulteration is you prep or dilute the substances. So there's teaspoons and milligrams and things on this screen that are going to be hard to remember when you're at a festival trying to get high. It's not going to cut it. Typically, there is an appropriate amount of water to milligrams of drugs that you're testing. But in practice, what that looks like is when you have a substance, we're trying to keep in mind the chocolate chip cookie effect, right? Where fentanyl can be in some part of the substance and not others. Ideally, if you have the time and the patience, what would be best is if you dilute that whole substance in water and then test all of the water with a fentanyl test strip. And that's what these are on the far right. There's these fentanyl test strips. There's two different types now. DanceSafe just came out with a new one. But they're usually in these green bags. There's also the new fentanyl test strips from DanceSafe. And these are more effective in testing fentanyl and MDMA and methamphetamine. We have these for free in that corner, and if you don't leave here tonight with one, you are missing out. Not that they're expensive, they're pretty affordable if you don't want to get one from us, but they're free and you don't have to sign any papers or anything. But you get this little strip and you dip it in water up to the water line. Within a few, just put it in there for 10 to 15 seconds, pull it out, lay it flat. And then within a minute to 3 minutes, it's gonna turn red, kind of like a pregnancy test. If you have two, that's a good sign. Or I mean, maybe not for everyone with pregnancy, but I mean, yeah. If you have two, it means you don't have fentanyl in the substance. If you have one, it means maybe try it again, or you have fentanyl in the substance. And do with that data as you will. If you want to ingest it, maybe have Narcan around, which we'll get to in a minute. And if you don't, that's okay too. Both of those options, just being safe is what matters. So, yeah, if you can, crush up the whole bag, dilute it in water. If it's MDMA, toss back the water. It's the same thing. But sometimes, with cocaine, it's better to test it if you can dilute the whole thing in water. That's not always an option, though, to wait for however long it's going to take for all that water to evaporate. So, next best option to get a good sample, keeping the chocolate chip cookie method in mind, is to crush up the whole bag and then transfer that substance somewhere else, to a different bag, to a piece of paper, just to a different location. And then you're gonna have a pretty good sample of residue on the side of that bag that you crushed it up in. There's gonna be white powder, kind of like we saw in the picture of the scale here earlier. Then you can add water to that bag, swish it around, dilute all of the residue from the side of the bag, and test that. It's a pretty good sample for the whole bulk of whatever you're trying to test. It's not 100%, but on the field, at a festival, or, in a crunch, that'll do. Yes.
As a side note, the second line can be extremely vague.
Yes.
So if it's there at all, even if it's super vague, you can see it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Amber. So sometimes the second line here on the fentanyl test strip on far right, sometimes it's super thin, especially with MDMA or or MDA or methamphetamine. And that's what these dance safe test strips were supposed to help with, was having like a more clear, effective positive, or effective negative. Yes.
Would that indicate a lesser concentration, or like a darker would be a higher concentration?
Yeah, that's a good question. So any line indicates no concentration whatsoever. If there's any fentanyl in that substance at all, it's supposed to be just the one line. And also on that note, you'll see in that image in the upper right, there's a spot for 2 lines. If there's just one line on the top, that implies that there is fentanyl. But if there's just one line on the bottom, that implies that the test is invalid. And that's actually pretty common. It can happen if the fentanyl test strips get too hot. It's not something that you want to leave in your car or like by the window. So just be mindful of that. You know, if you do take these fentanyl test strips, they're okay in the cold, but don't put them in the heat or in the sun. Yeah. And also, you should totally take some from our back table over here. But they're also really cheap at dancesafe.com. They come out to about $150 each, which is pretty affordable for what you're getting. Really, is really affordable. And then there's also separate directions for pharmaceutical pills or LSD. We have a full table or a full instruction sheet at this back table for instructions for substances that are not powders already. For example, with a lot of pills, it's not uncommon for pills to have coating on the outside. So if you're chipping off a little bit of the pill, you might just be getting coating. And if it's a pressed pill, that's not a good sample to be checking. Okay. And also, the Psychedelic Club has a free substance checking program, and there's a number also on this back table that you can text, and it's completely anonymous. We won't even ask you for your name, and one of us will go and meet you out in a park somewhere in town in the middle of the day, and check your substances for you. We have the full dance safe reagent kit. We can also do the fentanyl tests for you if you're not comfortable doing them yourself or you're not sure. And we do it all the time, and all of us love to do it. So, alrighty. Okay, I'm gonna see if this video will play. I hope it's not too triggering for anyone. But in this video, what happened? This video was recorded in August 2021. It was an incident in San Diego where the sheriff's office said this deputy was he was dispatched to a call, and he was experiencing a suspected fentanyl overdose on site. And I think this video is what a lot of people in this room are afraid of. And there's a lot of misinformation in this video. And so much so that the sheriff's office came out with a public statement redacting the things that were said in this video and the things that happened. And it's just not what an opioid overdose looks like. So I think it's 2 minutes. Let's see if it plays. It's the sound. Uh-oh. Amber's gonna come help me. Of course, also, it's Fox News, so don't be surprised. That's okay if it doesn't work.
I mean, the video is on.
Yeah, it is not gonna work.
Isn't it the icon down at the bottom when you stop it?
This one?
Down at the
That one?
bottom, yeah.
It's on, yeah. I'll summarize it for you while it's playing. Y'all can be graced by, by my summarizing of this video. Okay, so this guy, he's going on a traffic stop. He finds a white powdered bag in the car that they're stopping. Immediately, the guy opens it, as cops, I guess, do. And some of the powder comes into the air. And immediate overdose, starts seizing and falls to the street. The other cop starts administering Narcan, and the guy is just in full-blown seizing. It's pretty bad, and he's saying, oh, it looks like it was either cocaine or fentanyl, and the way he's acting, it looks like it's a fentanyl overdose. We need to get him to the hospital. They put him in the ambulance, and the ambulance had statements saying that he kept falling back into overdose, which is common for fentanyl overdoses, but not like this. Fentanyl overdoses don't come on like that. They don't, it's not like this. So you can see him administering the Narcan. Later on, the sheriff's office said he was having seizures, not related to any of the substances in the car. But by that point, this video was already so greatly dispersed, it had seen so many people, that the damage was already done. And honestly, I do think that this video was my first time ever seeing anything about fentanyl. I was reading about fentanyl and saw this video. And I think that it largely attributed to a lot of the misinformation that we have about what fentanyl overdoses look like, what opioid overdoses look like on the street. And it's really dangerous because it gives people the impression that if someone is having an opiate overdose, especially fentanyl, it's not safe to help them. And that's not true whatsoever. If someone is having an opiate-related overdose, you're safe to help them. I read, while I was doing research for this presentation, I read that even in a fentanyl lab, you have to be working in that lab for almost an hour for the gas, the powders flying around and the gases and all of that to have any sort of effect on you typically. So, it's pretty marginal gas, obviously, but yeah, just not a good video for representing an opioid overdose. So let's see, what does an opiate overdose look like, which includes fentanyl. What does a fentanyl overdose look like? First off, how it happens is there's slow breathing. That's followed by the breathing stopping. And then the lack of oxygen can cause brain damage, and soon enough the heart will stop. When the body stops breathing, the heart's gonna stop. And then from there, there's ultimately death. But that process takes time. It doesn't take a lot of time. It's not instant, but it takes time, and there's time to respond, most importantly, but not time to waste. So, there's some differences here that are important to clarify. There's someone who's high, or maybe too high, and then there's an overdose. So what does high or too high look like? Drowsy, but arousable. So they usually respond to the sternal rub. That's where you'll put your knuckles and just right across the ribs. That hurts. And if they're not overdosing, they're gonna definitely react to it. The speech is usually slurred, drowsy, but breathing. And this felt like a little short to me, but the research I found was saying breaths 8 or more times a minute. And then an overdose, small pupils, can also happen if you're high or too high. But usually always actually, for an opioid overdose, there will be small pupils. Not arousable, even with the sternal rub. Not speaking. And the breathing is slowed or stopped, so less than 8 times a minute. And sometimes there's also like choking sound or gurgling or snoring. And then there's blue or gray lips and or fingertips because the circulation has slowed or stopped. And when this happens, you can respond to it. It's not too late. You should respond to it. The first thing is to call 911. That's always got to be, just do it. Just call 911. In Colorado law, there's the 911 Good Samaritan law, which states that the person who calls is immune from criminal prosecution for an offense when the person reports in good faith an emergency drug or alcohol overdose. So that immunity also applies to anyone else who is at the scene. If you're in your apartment and there's one person out of the 5 of you who all had cocaine or whatever it may be from the same bag, one person is having an issue, the person who calls isn't going to get in trouble. The other people who are there shouldn't be getting in trouble. That's the 911 Good Samaritan law in Colorado. And the person who is having the issue, not going to get in trouble either. And then, after you call 911, perform rescue breathing, and then also administer naloxone, or Narcan is the brand name, if you have it. There's also a law in Colorado called the third-party naloxone law, and it allows for a person other than a healthcare provider or healthcare facility who acts in good faith to administer naloxone to another person who they believe to be suffering an opiate-related drug overdose. If you give Narcan to someone and they're not having an opiate-related overdose, but you did the former steps and you thought that they were, you're not going to get in trouble. It's all right. And that was also amended in 2020 to extend immunity to individuals who are administering expired naloxone. If you have a Narcan that's expired by 2 years, you should still try it. So after you do those things, after you call 911, administer naloxone, perform rescue breathing, once breathing is recovered, if it recovers, put them in the rescue position like this. You'll see their arm is under their head to provide support in case there's asphyxiation. And then stay with them until help arrives. If you're saying something like this, I really can't think of a single reason why you shouldn't stay with that person. You're not going to get in trouble. Yeah, it'll be all right. Okay. So the steps for administering Narcan, it's pretty straightforward. You gotta lay the person down flat on their back. This is the nasal Narcan. You'll peel off the back of the Narcan case, and then you'll put it in one of their nostrils, up one nose, up the other nostril, and then they should respond to it in 3 to 5 minutes, and if they don't, do another dose if you have one. There's also the syringe, which has Narcan, and for the syringe, you'll put it into muscle, so in their shoulder or in the front of the thigh, 3 to 5 minutes, and if it's an opiate-related overdose, they should be back. So what is Narcan doing? So here, as we talked before, when you have an opiate, the high happens when the opiate binds to the opiate receptors in the brain. So here in this picture, the blue are the receptors, or the opiates, binding to these receptors in the brain. So, naloxone, which the brand name is Narcan, one of the brand names, is also an opioid because it binds to the opioid receptors, but it does not make a person high like a lot of the opiates we're familiar with do, or opioids do. Instead, it blocks the other opioids from binding to the receptors. And because of that, sometimes it can cause a withdrawals within minutes for some people. If that person has a dependency on an opiate and you administer naloxone, there's not any opiates getting to those receptors, and that can cause withdrawals. So sometimes in situations like that, the people can get agitated or angry. Sometimes it can cause nausea or vomiting, chills, discomfort, disorientation, but you're preventing the overdose. And one thing that's really important when administering Narcan or naloxone is that it's a temporary Band-Aid. It's a temporary fix. So these bind to the receptors, but there's still opiates in the body. If that person is not able to process out the opiates out of their body before the Narcan is finished, they can fall back into an overdose. That's why it's important that you still call 911 if you ever do have to administer Narcan. It usually lasts 30 to 90 minutes, and it can restore breathing, which is the really important part. Yeah.
Do you know what the difference is, like, in the time of onset and duration between the intravenous or intramuscular and the spray?
I'm not sure. I saw 1 to 3 minutes across the board, but it might be faster or slower depending on the route of administration for the naloxone. Yep. And there's, oh yeah, do we have another question?
They also just came out with another brand that's 2 milligrams or 4 milligrams. It's twice as much like 8 milligrams because a lot of times it's fentanyl. One isn't enough.
Yeah. Okay, so there is another brand that came out recently that only requires administration once rather than multiple times, which Narcan can sometimes need. Is that right? Interesting. Interesting. I'll have to look into that. Thank you. So for Narcan, there's 2 places in town that are really great for getting Narcan. One of them is Access Point. I've been here. It's so great. These people are amazing. Access Point is a needle exchange, and what you'll do, you just walk in. They don't even take your name. They don't take any information from you aside from 3 letters that you give them, whichever 3 letters you want, the last 2 numbers of the year you were born, and a letter for your gender. And they write all those on a card. They give you a card, and you can use that card to come in here and get Narcan or whatever other services that they provide as a needle exchange. And it's 100% free. It's anonymous. My only thing with them is that their hours are sometimes hard to work with. They're open from 1 to 6 on Monday to Thursday, and then also 12 to 3 on Friday. And then also when you have that card, if you're getting other things from the needle exchange, if you get pulled over, they won't tag you for paraphernalia if you have it in the car. Not that having Narcan is paraphernalia. Narcan does not count. And then the other one is Harm Reduction Action Center. I haven't been here, but I've heard really good things about them. And they also have Narcan for free. And they're open from 9 to 12, Monday to Friday. Alrighty, and then a few more resources. So one of the best resources that I like to use for any substance across the board is Arrowwood. Arrowwood is amazing. And if you are using fentanyl recreationally, or you know someone who is, or you're considering it, Arrowwood is a really good place to start to just figure out like doses and what the high should look like and how to be safe about it. And then they also Arrowwood I love because they have trip reports. And so they have this full bank of pretty much any substance that you can think of, where people just write what their experience was like on that substance. And part of that is you can find substances included with other substances. So you can look up like MDMA with fentanyl, and you can see what it was like for someone who may have had an adulteration of MDMA with fentanyl or any other substance. And then, it's ran by these two people. This is Fire Arrowwood and Earth Arrowwood. Yeah, and they also have staff and countless volunteers. And their site, arrowwood.org, is one great resource. And then the second really good resource that they have is drugsdata.org. And so for this one, this is a paid service, but you can send in substances. It's, for example, if you have a pill, a pressed pill, any pressed pills they will check for $100, and any powdered substance they check for $150. And the difference is because if you have a pressed pill, there's probably other people who have that same pressed pill who are looking it up. So you're kind of like helping the community by sending it in. Whereas if you have a powder, like that, they can't really apply it to other people who are looking up powders in Denver. So what you do is you mail in the substance, it goes to California, and usually within like 3 to 5 weeks after having mailed it in, they run it through a mass spectrometry test, and they'll tell you pretty much exactly what's in it. And so, for example, these people submitted Molly and came back as Molly, or this one had oxycodone, came back as acetaminophen, metamizole, and then fentanyl. 11 parts fentanyl to 100 parts acetaminophen. So that would have been an adulterated substance someone bought as oxycodone, but it had fentanyl instead. And then just concluding thoughts. So really what we're trying to get at is that fentanyl can be an issue, but it doesn't have to be. It has really good potential in medical settings, and if you are not trying to ingest fentanyl, there's ways that you can be safe to make sure that you don't. And further to that point, it's important to recognize that a lot of people have really been hurt really seriously by fentanyl, and that's not a joke. And a lot of people have really had a lot of help from it too, in pain management and a lot of other really valuable approaches, and that's not a joke either. So there's space in this room for all of those people, and if you're using any substances, opiates or not, you should be careful to make sure that you know what you're ingesting. Are there any concluding questions? Yes.
I'm just curious if there's any knowledge about Suboxone and interaction with fentanyl.
Yeah, that's a good question. I do believe Suboxone works on the same receptors as fentanyl. They're both opiates, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So I'm not too sure specifically on how they interact with each other, but my estimate would be that if you were ingesting fentanyl and you had Narcan administered to you, or if you were ingesting, not fentanyl, if you were ingesting Suboxone and you had Narcan administered to you, it would negate the effect of the fentanyl, or negate the effect of the Suboxone up until the Narcan expires in the receptor. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah.
There's actually the naloxone and Suboxone. It's morphine and naloxone. Naltrexone, thank you. Which would be, I guess, the oral one. But a lot of people don't realize that morphine, it on some cellular receptors, it acts like narcotics.
the name of the medication that was Suboxone and naloxone?
Naltrexone.
Naltrexone. Interesting. Thank you. Yes.
Is the naloxone available over the counter?
So it is available over the counter at most pharmacies, but the thing that I don't like about that is that when you get Narcan at a pharmacy, they put it on your medication record. So for example, myself, I had a surgery last year, and I was administered, Percocet to help with the pain, and I asked for Narcan with it. The next time I went to the doctor's office, they asked me if I was still using opiates because I was given a Narcan at a pharmacy. I just don't like having that on my record. You know, I don't like having a record of, you know, potential abuse for a substance that I was prescribed. And, you know, because of that, like, they might not prescribe opiates in the future. So for that reason, I like to get Narcan from needle exchanges.
It's also like 30 minutes to wait there when they run your insurance and they want Narcan from the pharmacy.
That's true. Running insurance for Narcan is a joke. It should be free, which it can't be if you go to a needle exchange. All right. Any other question?
What's the expiration and like degradation terms on Narcan?
Yeah. So once Narcan is administered, it will last anywhere from 30 to 90 minutes.
Sorry, like the product, like you know how the fentanyl resistance?
Oh, yeah.
They decay, like how do you take care of it?
Yeah, I'm not too sure about storing Narcan, but from the packages that I've received, it lasts anywhere from 2 to 3 years. Yes.
Yes. Just from your research, what do you think with these videos, these cops, like, what is their explanation for like what's happening? Are they having panic attacks?
So for that video, they concluded that the person in the video is having seizures, but they also stated that they acted the best that they knew how with the information they had at the time. So law enforcement in that video was told that that's how Narcan overdoses happen, and that's what they need to watch out for and be careful of. And you know, that's pretty scary for law enforcement who's supposed to be responding to these kinds of calls, go into it with that kind of mindset that they need to be so fearful not only of the drug, but probably also of the people who are using it, you know. Yeah, a lot of misinformation. All right, any other questions? Yeah. All righty, yay! Thanks for coming.